Taking responsibility for your work is an outdated concept. These words came from a worker who came from China. What happened to the once vibrant small factory, Aoyama Manufacturing, which had fewer than 20 workers? Before we proceed with the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. By doing so, stories you're interested in will naturally appear. Now, let's dive into the details. The once bustling Aoyama Manufacturing has now shrunk to a small factory with only 20 employees. Most of them were replaced by low-wage Chinese dispatch workers due to the profit-focused policies of the company president, Fujita. The longtime veteran workers with a craftsman spirit were gradually laid off, and the factory began losing its soul. It was once home to over 50 skilled craftsmen, full of pride and expertise, but now that pride was fading. What Fujita believed in most was efficiency and cost-cutting. He dismissed the veteran craftsmen as outdated and brought in overseas workers who could be hired at lower wages. As a result, 80% of the factory's employees were now Chinese staff, with the veteran workers making up only 20%. Their wages had been cut in half, and they had lost much of their presence in the workplace. Former colleagues had left, and those who remained worked quietly and diligently without complaint. Sasaki was one of those veteran workers, staying at the factory even after reaching retirement age. He had worked there for over 40 years, and had a deep attachment and pride for the place. However, he felt that Fujita's cost-driven approach trampled on that pride. Yet he endured, wanting to protect the factory. Fujita, firmly believing that profit is what saves a company, increasingly relied on the dispatch workers from China. The veteran workers watched as their former colleagues were laid off one after another, each time a craftsman, who had worked with them for decades, left. Sasaki felt a growing emptiness in his heart. Yet, he gritted his teeth and held onto his pride in his work. Meanwhile, the Chinese staff who made up the majority of the workforce had entirely different values. For them, work was simply about doing the job on time and getting paid. Pride and responsibility were secondary. If there was a problem with the product, they would pass the blame to someone else and move on. When the clock hit quitting time, they would leave without hesitation, never considering fixing mistakes. One day, a major delivery was approaching for a large client. Fujita believed this deal would determine the future of Aoyama Manufacturing, and he left everything to the Chinese staff. On the surface, they seemed to be working efficiently, but in reality, there were ongoing shortcuts and lack of attention to detail. Sasaki had noticed the danger, but there were too few veteran workers left to oversee everything. On the day of the delivery, a serious flaw in a large batch of products was discovered, throwing the factory into chaos. They rushed to fix the errors, but there simply wasn't enough time. Fujita panicked and gave strict orders to the Chinese staff, but they lost their composure and began blaming each other. "It's not my fault, he did it." Voices of blame echoed across the factory, deepening the confusion. Taking responsibility for your work is an outdated concept, they said. As quitting time approached, the Chinese staff stopped their work, as if nothing had happened, and left the factory without a second thought. Fujita stood in shock, watching the factory fall apart around him. "What am I going to do? We won't make the delivery on time." He was at a complete loss. At that moment, Sasaki, who had been quietly working in a corner of the factory, stood up. He calmly approached Fujita and said, "President, let us handle this. We've put our lives into working at this factory for decades. Not for the money, but for the pride we take in our work. We will make sure everything is done in time." Fujita was speechless and could only stare at Sasaki. His words carried the weight of the company's history and embodied the spirit of Japanese craftsmanship. Sasaki immediately contacted the veteran workers who had been laid off. "The factory is in crisis. Please, for one last time, lend us your strength." Amazingly, his former colleagues started returning to the factory one by one. The stubborn Sato, who had just turned 65, and Suzuki, who at 72 was the oldest, also came. Veteran craftsmen with years of experience reunited, pushing their weary bodies to the limit and working together to start fixing the mistakes. They worked in silence, following Sasaki's instructions as they remade the products to perfection. In one night, the factory transformed back into its old self. The veteran craftsmen moved their hands with pride and skill, completing the products. Just as they had in the glory days of Aoboshi manufacturing. Not a single person stopped working or slept, even though many of them were pushing their aging bodies to the brink. They never gave up. On their backs was not just the weight of labor, but the responsibility to uphold Japan's tradition of monozukuri craftsmanship. They fought until the end, not for money, but to ensure that the techniques and soul they had built over the years would be passed on to the future. Morning came. As the delivery time drew near, all the products were finished. The veteran workers, exhausted but full of pride, prepared the products for shipment. Sasaki quietly nodded as he looked at the completed products. Fujita witnessed the scene and was at a loss for words. What unfolded before him was a miracle that could never have been achieved through efficiency and profit maximization alone. What he saw in front of him was something that couldn't be measured by numbers. It was soul. Sasaki, with a voice full of exhaustion, said to Fujita, "This is our pride. It's the spirit of Japanese craftsmanship. Something that can't be measured by efficiency or money." The delivery was successful, and the company survived the crisis. Fujita finally realized the importance of the human heart and craftsmanship pride that he had overlooked. He decided to take a new path toward reviving the factory. The value of the veteran workers was re-evaluated, and Aoboshi manufacturing was reborn, as a place where the skills and pride of the craftsmen thrived once again. The spirit of Japanese craftsmanship will continue to burn bright. Thank you for watching until the end. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. We look forward to your thoughts in the comments.